Imagine a world where an invisible enemy kills millions of people, hollows out armies, and quietly nudges a superpower off its golden path. Now, imagine that world is not medieval Europe, but the Roman Empire at its height. In the year 165 CE, Rome was celebrating. The emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus ruled an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the frontiers of Persia. The legions had just returned from hard-fought campaigns in the east. They brought back triumph, treasure, and something else. Somewhere along the siege lines of Seleucia or the ports of the eastern Mediterranean, a pathogen jumped into Rome's global network. It hitched a ride on ships carrying grain, on soldiers marching along perfectly engineered roads, on merchants moving through the empire's crowded urban hubs. Within months, people began to die. The disease struck like a slow-moving fire. It often began with fever and chills, then gastrointestinal problems, diarrhea that darkened as the illness progressed. After about 2 weeks, the skin erupted in pock-like lesions, large, dark, and eventually scabbing over. Galen, the most famous physician of the age, described patients coughing up or excreting scabs as if their bodies were rotting from the inside out. The full course of sickness lasted 2 to 3 weeks. Many recovered, scarred but alive. Many did not. Modern estimates suggest that among those infected, roughly 1 in 4 died. Across the empire as a whole, perhaps 5 to 10 million people were lost, something like 5 to 10% of the total population. In the city of Rome, one ancient historian claimed that at the height of a later wave, around 189 CE, up to 2,000 people were dying every single day. Even if that number is exaggerated, the shock was real. This catastrophe unfolded in a world that believed it understood order. Roman engineers could force rivers to move. Roman generals could redraw maps. Roman administrators could count taxpayers and grain ships, and soldiers with bureaucratic precision. Yet here was something that road systems, legions, and ledgers could not stop. The military took an immediate hit. Legions, already far from home, were ravaged by sickness. Campaigns stalled. The emperors needed warm bodies more than ever, and they began recruiting people who, in other times, would never have worn Roman armor. Slaves, gladiators, non-citizens from the fringes of the empire. The traditional citizen-heavy core of the Roman army thinned out, replaced by whoever was available. On paper, the legions still existed. In reality, their character was quietly changing. Away from the frontiers, the economic impact spread like a secondary wave. Fewer hands in the fields meant less grain and more pressure on the state's food system. Cities like Rome depended on vast imports of grain from North Africa and Egypt. Any disruption, crop failures, transport issues, or simply not enough people to work the farms, could turn quickly into hunger and unrest. Local elites, the men who funded public buildings, games, and basic urban services, were especially hard hit. They gathered in cities, they sat on councils, they attended public events. In other words, they lived exactly where a contagious disease spreads fastest. As they died, city councils struggled to fill offices, and the administrative skeleton of the empire began to look brittle. At the same time, the climate itself was quietly turning against Rome. For centuries, the Mediterranean had enjoyed what historians call the Roman climate optimum: warm, relatively weather with reliable rainfall. Around the 2nd century, that pattern began to shift. Temperatures trended cooler, conditions became drier and more erratic. Harvests grew less predictable. In hard years, peasants might abandon marginal land and crowd into cities where state grain and charity were more accessible. That meant more people packed into dense neighborhoods, relying on long-distance supply chains. Perfect conditions for any pathogen trying to move. The Antonine Plague did not cause the climate to change. It did not single-handedly bring down the Roman Empire, but it struck at a moment when the system was already under more stress than anyone realized. People naturally turned to religion and ritual to make sense of what was happening. Temples and shrines filled with supplicants begging the gods for mercy. Apollo, long associated with both plague and healing, took on renewed significance as the arbiter of evil. At the same time, new religious movements and cults promising protection, healing, or community support gained followers. Christianity, still a small and occasionally persecuted sect, offered not only explanations about suffering, but also networks of practical care for the sick, the widowed, and the orphaned. In a world of mass death, those networks mattered. The psychological impact ran deep. The Roman Empire had long imagined itself as a kind of eternal machine. Armies, taxes, and laws grinding forward, no matter who sat on the throne. The Antonine Plague exposed how much that machine depended on living, breathing humans, not just as numbers in a census, but as workers, soldiers, parents, priests, and local leaders. When enough of them disappeared, the gears began to grind and slip. And all the while, nobody knew exactly what they were dealing with. For a long time, historians were confident that the Antonine Plague was smallpox, the pock-like rash, the scabbing, the severe mortality. These all fit a familiar pattern. Schoolbooks and popular histories routinely stated this as fact. But over the past decade, that confidence has been shaken. Geneticists have extracted ancient DNA from skeletons carrying variola virus, the cause of smallpox, and from related pox viruses. By building evolutionary family trees, they've tried to estimate when the classic, fully virulent form of smallpox emerged. The results suggest that our modern version of the disease may be surprisingly young, possibly too young to have caused the Antonine Plague at all. Earlier, more ancient pox viruses existed, but they might not have behaved exactly like the smallpox we know from the early modern period. Meanwhile, epidemiologists have taken the reported timing and scale of the Antonine outbreaks and tried to see which known disease model fits best. They've tested scenarios with smallpox, measles, and forms of plague, using SIR and SCR models to simulate spread in a city like Rome. None of these candidates produces a perfect match. Some can get close in overall deaths. None neatly reproduces legendary numbers like 2,000 dead per day. The honest answer is, we don't know. The Antonine Plague was almost certainly a severe exanthematic disease. That is, one with a systemic infection and a widespread rash, often compared to smallpox or measles. But no specific pathogen has been definitively identified. That uncertainty is important. It reminds us that looking backward through the lens of modern medicine can be dangerous. If we simply say, "That sounds like smallpox," case closed. We risk forcing the past to fit our expectations instead of letting the evidence speak. The more we learn from genetics, climate science, and modeling, the more cautious we become about simple stories. So what did the Antonine Plague actually do to Rome? It did not flip a switch and end the empire overnight. That makes for good drama, but bad history. Instead, it acted like a stress test. It revealed weaknesses and accelerated changes that were already underway. Militarily, it weakened the traditional core of the legions and pushed Rome to rely more on non-traditional recruits. Economically, it strained agriculture taxation, and urban food supply systems. Socially, it hollowed out local elites and opened space for new groups and ideas. Spiritually, it shook faith in old protections and opened hearts and minds to new religious movements. Environmentally, it coincided with a shift to a less forgiving climate that would continue to complicate life for centuries. Taken together, these changes did not destroy Rome, but they helped turn the high, confident empire of the 2nd century into the more anxious, crisis-ridden empire of the 3rd. Why does any of this matter to us? Because the structures that carried the Antonine Plague across the empire, global trade, mass movement of troops, densely populated cities, long-distance food supply chains are all things we recognize today, simply scaled up and wired into jet engines and fiber optic cables. The climate dynamics that made Romans more vulnerable. Shifting temperatures, altered rainfall, food insecurity are also familiar. Only now we're living through them with the added push of human-driven climate change. The Antonine Plague is not just a story about an old disease. It's a case study in how human systems interact with biology and climate. It shows how an empire that thought of itself as stable and eternal could be rattled by a pathogen we still cannot name with certainty. It also hints at a more uncomfortable question. When we look back at Rome and say, they didn't realize how fragile their system was, are we really just talking about them? Plagues test civilizations. The Antonine Plague tested Rome's. Our own pandemics are testing us. The Romans did not pass or fail in a simple sense. They adapted, changed, and stumbled on. The empire survived for centuries, but it was never quite the same. The lesson is not that any one virus will end the world. It is that the strength of a society lies in how honestly it faces its vulnerabilities, how wisely it responds to shocks, and how willing it is to learn before the next test arrives. History does not repeat itself exactly, but if you listen carefully, the Antonine Plague still has something to say.